our next presenter is Jessica Stefano. Jess is also from QUT. She is a researcher whose work explores the intersections of Indigenous jurisdiction, law, and end-of-life decision-making. Her scholarship examines how Indigenous communities navigate and contest settler-state legal frameworks, particularly where cultural authority and state regulation intersect. Today she will present Whose Law Governs Dying? Indigenous Jurisdiction and Settler State Regulation in Voluntary Assisted Dying Literature from Australia, Eritrea, Canada and the United States. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Stefano.
Hi, thanks, Tash. Just want to confirm that you can see my slides. Fantastic. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to all the amazing presenters that we've had this afternoon. Okay, that's not going. Oh, there we go. Now it's working. So I'd like to start this afternoon by acknowledging the unceded lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people where this research took place and where I'm presenting from today. I acknowledge elders past and present, their languages, laws, enduring custodianships of this land, waterways and skies. I acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and all First Nations people joining today. Sovereignty on this continent and across the lands I speak of today has never been ceded. So my name is Jess Stefano, and I'm a white settler social worker and my first year PhD student. I acknowledge that my presence here, my education and my safety is shaped by systems that continue to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their land and law and jurisdiction. These are not past injustices. They are structures of privilege that remain deeply embedded in our institutions, especially health. My PhD investigates how Queensland's voluntary assisted dying framework operates within a longer genealogy of colonial health law that has positioned Indigenous peoples as destined to die. It examines whether contemporary VAD policy reproduces the foundations of terra nullius by denying Indigenous sovereignty, relational ontologies of passing, and jurisdiction over end-of-life care. The research I'm presenting today is the findings of a scoping review I undertook as a part of my literature review. I do not speak for Indigenous people. What I offer today is a critique of how settler colonial power continues to shape voluntary assisted dying, or VAD policy, in ways that obscure Indigenous governance and relational ethics. I speak into a conversation long led by Indigenous scholars, elders, clinicians, and communities. My accountability lies with them. To frame our discussion, I want the testimonies of Indigenous people provided into VAD reviews to speak first. Elder Paulette of the Dene Nation testified to Canada's Senate. I'm asked now in the late stages to amend this act. I should have been asked right from the beginning. You should have had Indigenous people sitting down with government people and designing this legislation. And an Aboriginal participant in Victoria's 5-year review of VAD put it this way: imagine asking permission to die from the very system that once denied your right to live. Those two sentences capture the heart of today's talk. Settler states presume authority over Indigenous death, while Indigenous people are invited to comment only after the rules are set. So voluntary assisted dying refers to the legal healthcare practice whereby a person with decision-making capacity requests medication that they take or have administered to end their life. That is now accessible across every state of Australia and in the Australian Capital Territory and throughout Aotearoa, Canada, and across 11 US jurisdictions. Public narrative celebrates VAD as humane, dignified, and a triumph of patient autonomy. Yet, autonomy in British settler colonial colonies is never neutral. The same states were built on violent subordination of Indigenous nations, the theft of land, the policing of movement, the removal of children, and the criminalisation of ceremony and language. Health systems are stitched into that history. Critical race logic reminds us that law often describes itself as race neutral, yet it encodes racial hierarchies into its very structure. So when VAD legislation celebrates the right to choose, we must ask whose concept of choice, whose ethics of care, and whose authority to govern death. The guiding question of my scoping review was, how are Indigenous peoples and perspectives represented or erased in published and policy discourse on VAD across Australia, Aotearoa, Canada, and the United States? I followed Ansky and O'Malley's 5-stage scoping methodology. I searched 5 academic databases, examined websites, Indigenous-led reports, and conducted citation tracking using snowballing techniques. 23 sources met the inclusion criteria, 10 being peer-reviewed articles and 13 grey literature documents. Critical race logics provided a lens on how I approach the assessing, analysing, and critiquing of the data. I continuously asked, where does whiteness operate as the default? How is colonisation framed, either as a historical backdrop or as a structure that organises life and death today? What is said and who is not heard? Undertaking the scoping review, a total of 11 themes emerged. Today, I will focus on 4: silence, performative consultation, relational sovereignty, and sovereign affirming care. The first finding is silence. In the United States, the review uncovered a striking gap. No peer-reviewed or grey literature engaged with Indigenous perspectives on VAD. Not a single study or fact sheet acknowledged the frameworks of Native American, Alaskan Native, or Kanaka Maoli nations. What makes this silence more troubling is that the US literature did explore VAD amongst other culturally diverse populations, but Indigenous peoples were excluded entirely. This is not just an oversight. Indigenous people in the US are not minority groups. They are sovereign nations with their own health governance, law, and ancestral relationships to life and death. The second theme is consultation without power. The pattern is consistent across the remaining colonies of Australia, Aotearoa, and Canada. Laws are drafted first, and Indigenous peoples are asked to respond after the fact. Despite legal obligations under the Treaty of Waitangi in Aotearoa and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in Canada, consultation has been symbolic and extractive at worst. Pre-legislative engagement relied heavily on written submissions. However, these submissions were not always authored by Indigenous communities or Indigenous-led organisations. Instead, non-Indigenous stakeholders often submitted without Indigenous communities' engagement or permission. These submissions frame communities as vulnerable or at risk, reinforcing deficit narratives and denying Indigenous agency. In Australia, only 3 examples of Indigenous consultation emerged. Victoria's post-implementation review, which was Indigenous-led by Professor Arabina, and the Northern Territory 2024-2025 inquiry, which undertook on-country consultation with elders, interpreters, and Aboriginal community control health organisations. Across all the reviews, participants called on any bad law to be grounded in cultural safety, kinship, and relational autonomy. In Aotearoa, consultations in the End of Life Choice Act failed to fully engage Māori societal law. While Māori voices have since been included post-implementation, Māori assertions of sovereignty over death remain more aspirational than realised. And in Canada, the exclusion was explicit. Elder Paulette told the Senate, the knowledge holders should have been at the table right from the onset, no 2 ways. And Dr. Suzanne Stewart called the process insulting and dismissive. Only after public backlash did Health Canada begin developing an Indigenous engagement plan, yet whether it has been Indigenous-led remains to be seen. True consultation begins with Indigenous authority, not with settled benevolence and bureaucratic timelines. The third finding is relational sovereignty versus liberal autonomy. Across all jurisdictions reviewed, Indigenous decision-making at the end of life was consistently described as relational, collective, and grounded in kinship-based governance. Rather than framing choice as an individual act, decisions are made with and through families, elders, and broader community networks, reflecting systems of Indigenous sovereignty that stand in deep contrast to Western biomedical focus on autonomy and individual consent. In Aotearoa, elders spoke of death as a family decision. The Northern Territory and Victorian reviews both acknowledge that many Aboriginal people see end-of-life choices as collective and grounded in kinship obligations, not individual preferences. Yet these frameworks are excluded from VAD systems. In Victoria, Arabina and colleagues reported that families and communities have not been allowed to be part of the process of having open communication, understanding and respect for individual choices within familial and cultural contexts. Across the literature, the tension between relational sovereignty and liberal individualism was repeatedly identified. As McCormick testified to Canada's Senate, MAID is known as MAID is known, emphasizes the individual right to autonomy without taking others into consideration. This is different from our responsibility to family, community, and land. Finally, across Australia, Aotearoa, and Canada, the literature consistently affirms that end-of-life care that truly respects Indigenous sovereignty must enable Indigenous people to make decisions grounded in their own laws, cultural values, and community-defined responsibilities. Individual testimonies highlight that care becomes sovereign affirming when individuals can remain on their own lands, access services in their languages, co-design and manage healthcare services, and be supported by Indigenous-led healthcare workers and community carers. In Australia, the Northern Territory reviews echoed this, highlighting the vital role of interpreters and cultural brokers in ensuring that VAD information is culturally appropriate. Both reviews recommended designing a VAD system that keeps people close to home, on country, with access to Aboriginal-led health services and a culturally safe workforce. In Aotearoa, the use of Te Aroha Māori, family support and guidance from elders and Māori health navigators were seen as essential to dignity at the end of life. Practices such as Māori death doulas affirm not just culture, but sovereign affirming over dying. Across the literature, it was also highlighted that it was important to acknowledge that interpreters and health workers hold their own kinship and community responsibilities and should never be forced to act against their kinship and cultural protocols. Across all jurisdictions, participants' testimonies emphasise that Indigenous health and other support roles are not optional. They are essential. They hold up community law, cultural protocols, and self-determining authority over life and death. Taken together, these findings show that VAD policy is not a neutral legislation and health practice. It's a side of colonial governance. Critical race logic sharpens that view by asking who is rendered knowledgeable, whose knowledge is screened out, and whose power is preserved. First, the US silence in itself is a finding. In jurisdictions that legalize VAD, the total absence of Native American, Alaska Native, and Kanaka Maoli perspectives is not a gap wanting for research funding. It's an act of erasure. Epistemic violence operates here by making Indigenous sovereignty literally unthinkable inside policy discourse. Silence clears a bureaucratic path. If no Indigenous voice is recorded, no Indigenous law needs to be recognised. Where visible speech does occur in Australia, Aotearoa, and Canada, it appears largely through performative consultation. Written submissions are invited after legislation is drafted, Indigenous knowledge is filtered through non-Indigenous professionals, and critically, the policy template, individual autonomy, biomedical, and state oversight remains untouched. Consultation functions less as collaboration and more as rubber stamping settler authority. Inside those submissions, Indigenous peoples are framed through a lens of vulnerability. That label does political work. It pathologizes communities as passive recipients of protection, while repositioning the very state that produced structural scarcity as a benevolent guardian. In effect, vulnerability language converts historical wrongdoings into contemporary caretaking. Yet, Indigenous voices contest both the framing and the framework of VAD. They articulate an ontology in which death is a relational transition, a ceremony of kin, country, and ancestors, utterly at odds with VAD's legislation's possessive individualism. This is more than a cultural difference. It's an ontological clash. Attempting to add culture to a system premised on exclusive individual autonomy does not bridge the divide. It reinscribes it because it demands that collective spiritual obligations squeeze into a checkbox for individual consent. Finally, the absence of Indigenous and community-led VAD care is not a neutral gap. It's a racialized outcome of settler colonial logics that continue to position Western biomedical authority as the sole arbiter of critical and ethical decision-making. When Indigenous peoples are excluded from designing and delivering end-of-life care, the system denies their jurisdiction, etymologies, and sovereign rights. This exclusion reproduces structural racism and maintains a white institutional control through the appearance of cultural neutral policy. In contrast, when VAD is led by Indigenous communities on country, in language, through kinship-based care, it disrupts the possessive logics of settler governance. It repositions authority where it begins, with Indigenous nations as law holders and decision makers. Indigenous-led VAD care is not simply more exclusive, it's structurally different. It affirms that end-of-life care is not just clinical, but political, relational, and cultural. It signals a shift from inclusion into a system to transformation of the system itself. And that is where racial justice demands not better representations within white frameworks, but redistribution of power that centers Indigenous sovereignty and community control. Voluntary assisted dying law is not simply failing to include Indigenous people, it is actively structuring their exclusion, incorporating them only when their voices can be neutralized as data points or managed as risks. Until Indigenous nations are empowered to lead, shape, and reject VAD legislation on their own terms, these policies will remain tools of settler governance, draped in the language of compassion. So I leave you with these three questions. Who governs death? Whose law decides what counts as a good passing? And what does it mean to pass sovereign? Real justice begins where settler jurisdiction ends. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Jessica. Some really important topics covered there.